Last week, I got just a little teeny weeny bit annoyed. Okay, I got pretty pissed off, I'll admit it, with some of the comments on my pultec curve matching video. Now, my intention with last week's video was to purely show how you could use the circuit model pultec curves in Kirchhoff to closely replicate the curve behaviour of an EQP1A and a few other pultecs. I never said Kirchhoff could sound identical, just that you could reenact the same curve behaviour with the same amount of bands, which was something I struggled to do with other digital EQs prior to making this video. I thought this would personally be enough, but obviously, for some, taking time to match 5 different pultecs isn't enough to class my content as satisfactory, as there were no audio examples. Like, seriously.
How much fucking time do you think I have these days? I do work full time, you know.
However, seeing as I am such an unbelievable pushover, I have decided to give the moaners the audio examples that they so require to get on with the rest of their day. So let's do bettermaker, as I did state that with the same amount of bands I could match the curves with ease. I've even went to the bother of matching the fixed high pass filter where the frequency response and phase have the best average match. Now as you can see, it looks extremely close in Doctor and the phase is remarkably close until you get to the high end. There is nothing I can do to fix this, and this is where many will be like,
Got you now, you little bugger. Try getting out of that one.
Well, here's the thing with a lot of analog emulations. A lot. And I mean a lot of plugin developers use brickwall filters at Nyquist for whatever reason. Now, I'm not a coder, so I can't tell you why even linear plugins use these super steep low-pass filters. I understand it from an aliasing point of view, but I assume there's a reason behind it for linear EQs, as even Waves F6 EQ cramps. Now, with any filter, especially high-pass and low-pass filters, you will experience a phase shift of some sort, dependent on whether it's linear, minimum, or analog phase. Now, as you can see in Doctor, the phase relationship between Kirchhoff and bettermaker becomes closer the higher the sample rate is. This is because the frequency range is extended at higher sample rates. So when using bettermaker at 48K, which only has a bandwidth of 42 kHz, that steep low-pass filter encroaches into our audible spectrum, which means that we have a more noticeable phase shift in the high end. Now, not to disappoint the boo boys, let's try out some audio examples. First up is a pink noise null test, and I'll use span to monitor the results. Now, that's pretty unsurprising, isn't it? When the frequency response and phase match very closely, they practically cancel each other out. And yes, even that low-end pultec trick has been closely matched, as I'm barely getting anything coming through past minus 80 dB full scale. Barring the high end, which we know, even though closely matched, still doesn't have identical phase. But even still overall, as you can see by the RMS meters, it's around minus 60 dB full scale of an overall difference, which is practically inaudible. As I'll prove in a side-by-side test on a little jazz number. Now, I don't think there's any real audible differences here to the point where I'd argue nearly everybody would fail a blind test. But as I am proving a point here as always, let's try 192 kHz, which gives us a bandwidth of 96 kHz. And would you believe it, the phase now matches in the high end. This is because Kirchhoff uses what they call Nyquist match theorem, which essentially means that their analog modelled curves react more like analog curves which don't suffer from EQ cramping or steep low-pass filters. Now I wonder if my pink noise null test will be reduced even further by now having the phase near bang on. And yes, the high-end differences have now been further reduced, which now means that the overall pink noise null now reads at around minus 70 dBFS, which was about the same as the mag null from a few weeks ago. So as you can hear, Kirchhoff not only matches bettermaker near identically from an audible point of view, but actually gives you bettermaker curves at 192 kHz due to the Nyquist match theorem. That's right, controversial I know, but many analog emulations do indeed sound more hardware-like at higher sample rates. To be honest, I don't know why I didn't notice this before, but it does make sense now, seeing as 44.1 and 48K only have bandwidth that extend to 22 and 24 kHz. And just to prove that these filters don't exist in the analog domain, here is the readouts of 2-axis analog pultecs via Bertum Curve Analyzer. As you can see, no steep low-pass filters and no cramping in the pulse hardware and also the warm audio. However, what I will say right now is that honestly, this is as far as my knowledge regarding phase goes. So we know that when phase and frequency response is closely matched, we can take an educated guess that the two files will sound incredibly close. And to prove this further, let's take a look at the acustica pultecs, which in reality was the main reason why many were asking about phase, as let's face it, a linear digital plugin sounding very close to a sampled convolution plugin is sacrilege. Now, when it comes to matching low-end roll-offs, it's actually quite straightforward. It's a bit finicky, to be honest, but it's just all about setting a high-pass filter with the right Q factor and slope, which is easy as Kirchhoffs are variable unlike many others which are fixed. Once you get the frequency response and phase to have an even match, there will be no issue in dealing with that low-end phase shift brought in by the pass-through of the circuitry. However, I'll admit that no matter what I tried, and I tried a lot, I couldn't effectively match the high-end phase in titanium and ruby. Now, I'll also say that I'm unsure how to take the high-end phase measurements in Doctor, as in Bertum, just a millisecond of latency can cause the wrong readings. I've got a feeling that isn't right in the top end, but I may be wrong. But however, let's try a null test out on a short piece of music that has a pretty prominent kick drum low end. This is important to me as I've always championed the low end of the titanium pultec over other pultecs. So nailing that TubeTech low-end pultec trick in Kirchhoff would be pretty huge for me. And as you can see, most of the low-end and low mids have practically cancelled out from an audible aspect. That high-pass filter really does make all the difference. And it just goes to show that when there isn't any audible harmonic content, as I showed last week, there's no issues in nailing the sound in an EQ if you can closely match the phase as well as the frequency response. As you can see, there's a natural shift in frequency response the further you go up the spectrum via the titanium pre, and this is something that I just have to admit isn't possible in Kirchhoff. Kirchhoff has only circuit modelled the curves, and there is no consideration given to the phase and frequency response of the unit's pass-through, which we all know contributes massively to the sound. Think of Kirchhoff's analog modelled curves as the circuitry of the curves without being affected by transformers, tubes, impedance, etc, etc. The analog modelled curves are indeed clever, but it'll never fully deliver analog results like convolution, which samples every part of the unit and results in realistic impulse responses. However, let's try a blind test to see if you can all guess which is which. Leave your comments down below, as I'm interested to see if you all can not only hear the high-end phase shift, but also pick linear circuit model curves to sampled convolution. And as a final test, I thought I'd do the same with Ruby, but this time really try to get it as close as I can. I'm using the low shelf, low cut and the high boost. I've set up the high pass filter in order to closely match the low end like I did in titanium. And even though there are still phase differences in the highs, I'm interested to see if you can all pick out the phase difference, as like in titanium, the lows and a lot of the mid-range is pretty cancelled out. Also very important to mention is that I am using the analog phase in Kirchhoff, as it does make a difference when comparing to acustica, as I noticed as much as a 5 dB difference in the null when using analog mode compared to minimal phase mode. However, back to the Ruby test. Unlike titanium, where I can only match the lows, I've curve matched everything including the pre-interaction, so let's see if you can all pick out Ruby in the blind test curve matched with phase differences in the high end. And there you have it. Let me know in the comments which one you picked and if you could really tell me which was which, as that Ruby one is still pretty damn close to the point where I don't think an average listener would be able to tell the differences, but we know there are still differences. I think what this video has reminded me is that what's always important is to always remember that phase is something that always affects our audio, whether it be recording drums or EQing afterwards. It's something I don't really pay much attention to unless I'm mixing drums, but I'm glad that I'm being reminded that phase always has a sound, whether it's minimal, analog or mixed phase. And sometimes it can make things sound better and sometimes it can make things sound worse. I was pretty careless not to mention phase differences with acustica, as people may hear quite audible differences in my tests. But in the end, it's done now. You have the information that I can give you, and regardless of which you prefer, I'm glad we've cleared a few things up.
Even though I really couldn't be bothered making this fucking video.
If you want to know more about phase, then just fucking message Dan Worrell and not me, as I cannot be arsed learning any more about it. And also, before I forget, to this lovely gentleman who rattled me last week, just know that curve matching still has its place.
All right.
As always, thanks again for your time, and if you appreciate my time, then please consider dropping me a super thanks to support the channel, consider becoming a channel or Patreon member, or alternatively pop a like on the video. Either way, every little helps. See you next week.